Hi there! As a young girl, I was obsessed with tales about witches and queens and female warriors. That last one was inspired by the Disney film Mulan. But as I dove into my medieval studies, I realized there is a lot more to Mulan than Disney shows. And that's what we're diving into today. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's get medieval. I'm your host Jules, and yes, today we are talking about the medieval tales of Mulan, and specifically one of those versions. We're going to talk about the Song of Mulan, sometimes also called the Ballad of Mulan. As always, I'm first going to give you a plot overview. It's quite a short poem/song, so that's not going to be a whole lot of information, but we're absolutely going to dive into the nitty-gritty of it. And one thing we definitely need to address is also the idea of the medieval when we translate that into other cultures and other societies. So that'll be a big part. Then we'll just analyze some of the aspects of the poem elements I find really interesting. I already have a strong suspicion I'm going to try and include this in my own academic work. And maybe then we'll do a bit of a contrast to the Disney film. But let's get down to business. I'm going to read you the first verse, as always, and then dive into the plot. But I wanted to give a quick note on what edition I'm using, and that is a book called Mulan, 5 versions of a classic Chinese legend with related texts. And this was edited and translated with an introduction by Shiamin and Wilt Idema. I can absolutely recommend this edition. It has the Poem of Mulan, which we're talking about today, the Song of Mulan, which I'll mention briefly. It has a play, the female Mulan joins the army in place of her father, and it has excerpts from the script of different Chinese films which were made about in the 20th century, as well as summaries of other texts and novels, etc. It's honestly a great little book. It goes about 140, 150 pages, so it's not big, but it has so much information, and the introduction is absolutely invaluable, and I'll be using that or referring to it throughout the episode today as well. So if you're interested in Mulan, if you want to see some of those Chinese texts, if you want to have a thoughtful introduction which shows you how this story has developed, I can absolutely recommend this edition. With that sales pitch out of the way, let's get into the first verse of the Poem of Mulan. A sigh, and then again a sigh. Mulan was sitting at the door and weaving. One did not hear the sound of loom and shuttle. One only heard her heave those heavy sighs. When she was asked the object of her love, when she was asked who occupied her thoughts, she did not have a man she was in love with. There was no boy who occupied her thoughts. And so we're off. I am already at this point curious who the we is that is hearing this, who is observing it, and who the one is that is asking Mulan what is on her mind. Another interesting aspect is how her sighing is interpreted as a sign of love, and we're about to find out that she's not sighing over love. Instead, Mulan then goes on to tell whoever this person that asked, our narrator, the audience, etc., that she saw summons from the army, that the Khan is mobilizing his troops, that men have been asked to appear, and that every copy of this summons has her father's name. But he has no grown-up son, and she says, I, Mulan, have no adult brother. And so she's decided that she is going to take her father's place and join the army. That's how straightforward we are. We then get a lovely kind of almost montage of her getting ready. So she goes to the eastern market where she buys a horse, to the western market where she buys a saddle, the southern market where she buys a bridle, and the northern market where she bought a whip. And that's all she needs to transition from a female Mulan into someone who can take her father's place. She says goodbye to her dear parents, and then we follow her on her travels. First she rests by the Yellow River, and we get this lovely little couplet of 2 lines that say, she did not hear her parents' voices calling for their daughter. She only heard the yellow river's flowing water, always splashing, splashing. And then she leaves the yellow river behind, she travels to the Black Mountains, and again we get this line about her parents calling for their daughter, but she can only hear the whinnying of Crimson Mountain's Hunnish horsemen. From there we are told that she travels myriads of miles, that she joins the thick of the battle, that she crosses mountains, and that the wind makes the metal rattle. We are told that a freezing light shone on her iron armor, and that in 100 battles people died, and yet after 10 years the bravest men returned. When they returned, they met the Son of Heaven, who sits on his throne. They are given honorary ranks, and they get rewards, and the Khan then asks Mulan what he might desire. She, or rather he, says that they do not care for an appointment at court, they just want a good horse that can take them home so that they can rejoin their parents. And we again get a really strong emphasis on people hearing things. So the parents hear their daughter arriving, and then her sister, who we haven't heard about yet, hears her elder sister return as well, and then her brother also hears his elder sister return. And there is this kind of nice repetition there of how all her family members slowly but surely witness Mulan returning home. And she says, "Open the gates, let me in," and we get another lovely kind of montage of how this shift occurs. So she goes to her old Western room where she takes off the dress that she wore in battle, so her armor, and where she puts on a skirt. Then she does up her hair, faces the mirror, applies makeup, and goes outside where her army buddies are waiting. And they are, as the translation says, flabbergasted. They say, "We marched together for these 12 long years and absolutely had no clue that Mulan was a girl." And then in our final stanza, we get something of an analogy, which I'm going to read to you. "The male hare wildly kicks its feet. The female hare has shifty eyes. But when a pair of hares run side by side, who can distinguish whether I, in fact, am male or female?" And that is the poem of Mulan. I told you it was short, but I think it packs a lot of very interesting information. Apologies if you can hear the pages of my book as I'm turning it. So this was translated by Wilt and Idema, just to give them their credit there as well. Now I've already done a little bit of analysis and pointing out things that interest me, but before we go into a further discussion of the poem of Mulan, let's just briefly address our categorizations here. Now, as you all know, I am a medievalist. That is why I enjoy doing these Let's Get Medieval episodes, so that I can introduce medieval literature to a wider audience of 10, but also because I just enjoy talking about medieval literature a lot, especially because there are still a lot of preconceptions about the Middle Ages. I think people like to imagine the early modern period as one which introduced globalization, contact between different peoples, either through imperialism or modern inventions like long-distance flights. And for a long time, medievalists did very much consider their period an in-between one. But in recent years, they have begun to be interested in the global aspect of the period as well, of that period that we in the West call the Middle Ages. However, the West there is already problematic, and this new field of the global Middle Ages is also still a work in progress. We don't have hard definitions for many of the things that we're thinking about. And one big issue, and the reason I wanted to address it today, is that of periodization. If you grow up in Europe, that's the only thing I can talk about since that's where I grew up, you're raised with the clear division of time into antiquity, the Middle Ages, and then Renaissance/Enlightenment, and the early modern period, leading into our modern period or the Anthropocene now. As its name implies, the Middle Ages were considered something of a stopgap, an in-between period, and this idea stems from the Renaissance. The Renaissance, Enlightenment people, they saw themselves as this next step in culture and civilization, leading on from antiquity, so those high points of Greek and Roman culture, to their own time. You can hopefully already see that anyone looking back at what has come before and says, well, that's useless, that is worth questioning. So the Middle Ages, as we now define it, spans 1,000 years, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, so Common Era. And these periods are bookmarked by the fall of the Western Roman Empire on one end and the invention of the printing press and the start of the Reformation and Enlightenment on the other. This periodization then was, of course, spread across the globe due to imperialism and colonialism, but as you can imagine, it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for other cultures and societies to introduce their own perceptions of their own history. And that is what is relevant today when we're talking about a text from China. The poem of Mulan's dating is difficult, and I'll get to that in a second, but it is tentatively dated to the 6th century by some, and it's found in a manuscript from the 11th, most likely 12th century. So that would place it solidly in the Middle Ages, right? Well, yes, if we took a purely Western perspective. But China does not divide its history into these periods, and furthermore, that's my cat. I did adopt him in China, so it's fair he has something to say. But anyway, China does not divide its history into these periods, and furthermore goes back way further than 2 or even 3,000 years. Chinese history and how it and its cultural process are discussed is defined by its dynasties. The first dynasty noted in Chinese historiography is the Xia dynasty, which was established around 2070 BCE, so almost 4,000 years ago. Those 4,000 years cannot be crammed into a Western periodization. It would be rude to even try, I think. So while I'm covering the Poem of Mulan in a Let's Get Medieval episode, let's do so with the full awareness that it emerged from a vastly different cultural and historical background. So let's get into this dating and the evidence that the poem itself provides for that. The Poem of Mulan is usually dated to the Northern Wei dynasty, which ranges from roughly 386 to 535 Common Era CE. The reason for this is that while the poem doesn't really state its historical setting, it does give clues. One of those is the use of the word Khan or Karan and Son of Heaven as titles for the emperors. These were titles which were used during the Northern Wei dynasty. This dynasty was founded by the Tuoba, and in Middle Chinese, I think it would have been pronounced Takbat. And I'm going to do my very best to pronounce these Chinese names properly. So they were founded by the Tuoba clan, who were ethnically Xianbei. They united northern China in the 4th century and were nomads from the northern steppes. They took on the dynastic name Wei and changed their name Tuoba to Yuan in a process which is called Sinicization, meaning the process by which non-Chinese societies or groups assimilated themselves into Chinese culture. Another element that speaks for this dating is that apparently Xianbei women were skilled horseback riders, something Mulan also does. The Northern Wei also engaged in warfare with the Rouran Khaganate, a tribal confederation of Mongolian people. This may also fit in with the war that Mulan has to fight. During this dynasty, the Poem of Mulan may have been told as an oral folktale, thereby retaining some of these cultural aspects before it was put down to paper. So this dating to the Northern Wei dynasty is generally accepted, but we do not actually have a manuscript from this time. Rather, the earliest manuscript we have is an anthology known as the Yuefu Shiqi, the Anthology of Yuefu Poetry, also known as the Music Bureau Collection, authored by Kuo Mao Qian from the Song Dynasty, which ruled from 860 to 12,079. While not a whole lot is known about Kuo Mao Qian, his work is usually dated to the late 11th but probably early 12th century. In his Yuefu Shiqi, he mentions an older text, the Kuchen Yuelu, or the musical records of old and new, a collection of songs and tales by the monk Shijiang from the Southern Chen dynasty, which lasted from 557 to 589, i.e. the 6th century. This text was lost, but Kuo Mao Qian mentions it specifically at his source for the Poem of Mulan. In fact, his Yuefu Shiqi contains 2 versions of the text, the one from the 6th century and a reworking kind of translation, expansion of the Poem of Mulan. This is called the Song of Mulan in my edition from the 8th century, written by Wei Yuanfu during the Tang dynasty. The version I shared with you is the Poem of Mulan, and as I said, I took it from that edition. This Song of Mulan is a longer reworking of the poem, not entirely dissimilarly to how, when I covered Atlakvida, I also mentioned the more elaborate poem Atlamal, which follows directly on it in the manuscript. So both the poem and the Song of Mulan are contained in the Yue Fushi from the 12th century, and that is how we get it today. So now that we've briefly addressed the issue of periodization, of thinking of it as a medieval poem and then maybe fitting it into Western perceptions, as well as the manuscript tradition, how this Poem of Mulan, written by an anonymous person, made it to us, let's dive into a discussion of the poem itself. So, like I said in my summary, I am fascinated by that opening verse, how we enter into a dialogue with Mulan, how we as the audience or the narrator ask her a question, and that is how we get into the plot of the poem. I find that super interesting because so much of the poem also seems to be about sounds, about what we're hearing, what we're witnessing. That is where the emotional impact of the poem comes from. So that's just a really intriguing first aspect. I also like that it is Mulan who tells us in the second verse why she's going to do what she's going to do, and that she denies the idea that she's sighing out of love, but rather that there is a genuine issue in her family, and that quite simply she has chosen to take her father's place. I also think that kind of montage of her moving to different markets and buying these attributes of masculinity or of a warrior identity, from a horse to a saddle to a bridle and a whip, those are the things that she takes on to become her father's son, to become a warrior. There is no kind of dramatic scene in which she then puts these on. Just her buying them and acquiring them is enough to then acquire a male identity. I also like that this is something her parents seem to be very aware of. This is not something that she's hiding, but rather a duty that she's fulfilling publicly, and everyone is going along with that. But then again, there is that emphasis as she rides away of her not hearing her parents anymore, but only hearing the nature around her. So again, the emotional weight of her moving away from her family is emphasized by the lack of hearing her family's voices, and how this is replaced by the sounds of nature around her, how she's left the perhaps domestic family life behind and has moved, well, into nature, into the wild. Then we get this description of her in the thick of battle, crossing mountains as if flying, wind rattling the metal, and I love the image of that freezing light which shines on her iron armor. It is such a spotlight on her in the middle of the thick of battle, in the middle of fighting, and I would love to know what the Middle Chinese actually says. Unfortunately, I cannot read Middle Chinese, and I can get along with a little bit of Pinyin, but my Chinese has abandoned me since I left China 4 years ago. But it is a fascinating image. And I also like how there seems to be, in the translation at least, something of a pronoun/identity shift, because that verse starts with her joining the thick of battle. It says she. And then at the end of that verse, it speaks about how the bravest men returned. And the next verse speaks of they. So they, the brave men, meet the Son of Heaven, the Emperor, and they have an honorary rank and they receive rewards. And then when the Khan asks Mulan, he asks what he desires. So we get a male pronoun here. Again, I would love to know if this pronoun switch also takes place in the Chinese version and how that functions there, because when Mulan then asks to return back home, the next verse switches back into reaffirming her female identity. And we again have this emphasis, like I said, on hearing, on witnessing certain sounds, and that asserting the emotional impact. Because we speak of her parents hearing their daughter, of her sister hearing her older sister, and her brother also hearing her older sister. It's also very interesting that she has these two siblings because they're not mentioned earlier. All that is mentioned is that her father does not have a son old enough to take on the duty of becoming a warrior. And so the poem suggests she does have two younger siblings, including a brother, but that he quite simply wasn't old enough yet, which I think says something very interesting about potential gender expectations already as well. And then I do adore that scene of her reverting fully back into a female identity. And this is something interesting that the introduction also describes about how the male identity is taken on by acquiring certain attributes, but that isn't described in full detail, whereas her reverting back to a female status or female identity is described in more detail, because we have her first taking off her battle dress, so her armor, putting on the skirt that she used to wear, putting up her hair, putting on makeup, and it very much suggests that this female identity is something to put on. And that is fascinating. I also very much enjoy the moment where she comes back outside, now dressed as a woman, and all her army buddies are like, wait, who are you? We thought we were fighting with a dude and now you're a woman. But there seems to be no judgment there. We don't see Mulan being rejected by her former army buddies. Rather, this is something that she chooses to do and they simply accept it. They're astounded by their own imperception, perhaps. And then, of course, there is that final verse about the male hare, the female hare, and how when the hares are running side by side, it is impossible to distinguish which is which. Now, the analogy has a couple of very interesting aspects to it, and here I'm relying quite strongly on the introduction of the edition, because what is said in the introduction is this, and I quote, "Femaleness is a kind of social role. It is an addition to the essential humanity of the male role. As the visual vocabulary and the hare metaphor seem to imply, gender, like a social role, is something that can be put on." And the end analogy with the hares makes that so clear. And when I read it the first time, I was just astounded by how direct it is in its comment on gender. Again, there are a lot of preconceptions about the medieval period, or if we want to take it more broadly, anything pre-modern. We like to imagine that debates about gender, about sex, about how we are in public, that these are modern debates. Just like we like to imagine that the issue of free speech is a modern one. But these are actually ideas that people have been thinking about, working on, expressing and discussing for centuries. And this hare analogy makes it so explicit in how it addresses the fact that, well, men and women might have different attributes, but these can be covered up. They can be taken on, they can be taken off. If you take on armor or put on a dress, well, who is to say what's underneath? And does it even matter what is underneath? If someone has taken up a certain role, shouldn't we just let them be in that role? So I find that super interesting. And this is also where my interest in the idea of the female warrior and the female avenger kind of comes from, because in most cultures, I think I dare say that, in most cultures there are very strongly defined women's roles and men's roles. And quite often the role of men in a society, especially a society that is very focused on honor or on saving face, is that of being an active avenger. So for example, as I discussed, I think in the episode on Atlakvida, there was a strong onus on avenging wrongs against the family, and especially on avenging killings in the family. If someone killed your father, you had to avenge that death. And that role of avenging usually falls on men. However, the Old Norse literature, as in Atlakvida with Gudrun, also has women occasionally stepping into that role, or perhaps rather female characters, I should say, since a lot of this early literature, we can't define the historic roots of that. We cannot retrace whether this was about actual people, if it was taken as historical fact, or if it was a story that was being told. But even if it's just a story that is being told, that is interesting, because also here in the Poem of Mulan, we see a woman, a female character, step into a male role and taking on the responsibilities of the family's honor. And although Mulan isn't actively avenging, perhaps, her story is still one in which we get to see a female character or a woman stepping into a traditionally male role. In a very interesting article called Gender, Genre and Discourse, the Woman Avenger in Medieval Chinese Texts, author Manling kind of compares the different iterations of the female Avenger in Chinese literature. And a certain conclusion that she comes to is that, and I quote, "The woman Avenger, because of her mobility and violence, represents an active mode of poetic femininity. Whereas male abandonment or absence is the condition of the passive mode of poetic femininity, the active mode continues to affirm male power in that the woman Avenger kills for her family, or more specifically for her father or husband. In complementary ways, then, both modes reinforce the fundamental gender ideology of women's submission to men." End quote. And I find this fascinating because it's true. So we look at female warriors, female avengers, and so often they get represented as these strong female characters, so independent, breaking boundaries, etc. And in many ways they are. But their stories also affirm this gender ideology of women standing in a different category than men. These women who step into a male role are almost always an exception, and they are there to prove that men should do a certain thing. So in the case of Mulan, we have her stepping into the role of a son, because there is no other son available, but a man has to go to war for this family. And she could not go there as a woman. She has to take on this male identity. And although there is an idea of breaking boundaries in the concept of a woman being able to perform that role just as well, if not better, she does still have to do it in the guise of a male. And thereby it does reinforce some of those gender ideologies. And yet, I cannot deny that as a woman, I find a certain strength in those images as well. And what is very interesting about the edition of Mulan by Shiamin and Wilt Idema is that they address the way in which the tale of Mulan has changed and shifted over the centuries, over the decades, by giving us versions of this poem from the medieval period or from earlier dynasties, and then also moving into more modern adaptations from the 20th and 21st centuries. And they kind of trace how the story of Mulan was retold at different times with different ideas and purposes. So a big element of the Mulan story initially is that of filial piety, which was incredibly important under the philosophical system of thought and behavior known as Confucianism or Ruism, which was developed by the Chinese philosopher Confucius, also known as Kongzhu, and he lived most likely in the 6th or 5th century BCE, before Common Era. And filial piety there is this incredibly strong aspect of having respect for your elders, especially for your father. And this also bleeds into that need to avenge a father's death or support him in whatever way. So Mulan's actions are completely acceptable within that system of filial piety, I think. Although it might be extreme in some ways that a woman would step in, someone has to step in. So we get this gap where a man cannot act because her father is too old and her brother is too young, but a certain role is required and she can step into it. That is, I think, a very important aspect of the tradition around Mulan earlier on. Shiamin and Idema also address how that then kind of shifted. So as Japan became involved and invaded China and during the Second World War, but including also afterwards in the communist period with Mao, the motivations that Mulan has kind of shifted away from this idea of filial piety towards people standing up for their country. So it became perhaps quite nationalist or patriotist. So Mulan is not so concerned about her father anymore, but rather she wants to defend her country against outsiders, against foreigners. And that was very interesting to read, to see how how that motivation shifts with time. So on the one hand, it's lovely to see how flexible this story is and that it can contain different meanings and different purposes. On the other hand, it's always slightly concerning to see a story like this be adapted by a nationalist agenda. And I'm very curious how, for Chinese women, this story would have worked if they saw the inspiration behind it, if it felt like a filial duty, or if it felt more patriotist, depending on when. I do also know from the book that in some ways it was also claimed for a kind of feminist awakening, as under communism, technically all people were equal. And that maybe there was also then a kind of early identification with, oh look, women can contribute just as much as men, if not more. But this does bring me back to the point that Manling was making, but that also gets repeated in the introduction, which is, and I quote from the introduction here, Mulan is ultimately not a role model to women who are expected to stay at home to serve the family as her sister does, but a role model to men. So the story of Mulan also very often was used as a way of inciting men to do better. And I think we can see that in some other versions of this kind of story in other medieval literature, that a woman stepping into a man's role demonstrates, on the one hand, this utter fragility of gender roles, as with that stanza about the hares, that maybe there is nothing to gender roles, that we imagine them and anyone can do whatever they want, and that how we perceive them kind of physically, but also how they present themselves, well, that is all that we can see. It says nothing about the intrinsic nature of a person. So on the one hand, it represents that fragility, and on the other hand, in this kind of literature, which almost always was written down by men, it serves as a warning to men that their position is fragile, that they should actually do better, that women could take over and therefore perhaps they should be made submissive. And as a warning to women that, hey, you might have the ability to move in there, but actually what you are doing is acting like a man. We all know that that region of warfare is not yours. So some of you may be allowed in, but never forget that you should actually go home afterwards. So it's this double-edged knife of these stories, which I always find so interesting. And I think it also explains the disappointment, and now I'm really going wide in my comparisons, but the disappointment that I felt as a younger girl when, for example, Éowyn in The Lord of the Rings goes to fight, takes on a male identity as well, puts on armor, and then afterwards returns back home, gets married, and becomes a healer. And I always felt this slight stab of disappointment that she would have to revert back to her old role. And I saw that as a kind of punishment somehow. I have grown older since having that first opinion, and I've discovered a bit more about, for example, how Tolkien saw that change in Éowyn, and that actually it was less of a, oh, now she has to go back into her cage, and more of a, she witnessed that violence and that warfare, realized that there was something kind of dark and painful within herself, and actually worked on fixing and healing herself and others afterwards. That it was less of a choice for the feminine and rather a choice against violence and darkness. And for Tolkien, as someone who witnessed World War I, who was on the battlefront and saw his friends die, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I started appreciating it a bit more as I grew older. But I still cannot deny that there is a part of stories like this which feel painful. Because while they seem to break the boundaries of gender roles, while they seem to suggest that all of us are capable of different things, they do reinforce that hierarchy somehow as well. And I think that back and forth, that slightly incomplete balance is fascinating. I think that's also why I'm so fascinated by those stories. So yeah, I think that was a bit of a ramble. But I did promise a brief comparison to the Mulan film, the Disney film, the animated one. I haven't seen the other one. And there are a couple of things that obviously immediately stand out. And the biggest one is that there are absolutely no supernatural elements to the Poem of Mulan. So the film, of course, relies quite heavily on a delightful little dragon, on the idea of ancestors, and they kind of appear in spirit form as well. So there is this sense of something slightly supernatural, which is completely absent in the poem, which very much remains on the human level. So that's a difference. And also the idea that Mulan steals away secretly is, I think, a very modern idea, rather than her fulfilling her filial duty by taking her father's place, which is accepted by her family. She has to sneak away. Similarly, there's a difference between how her troop, how her army buddies respond, because of course in the film, Mulan is discovered when she's injured and she is cast out, basically left to die on a snowy mountain. And that is not what happens in the poem at all, because she fights for 12 years as well, let's not forget. And her army buddies accompany her home. They see her as one of their troop, and they are more amazed at their own re-awareness that gender is just a construct, that they would have never guessed that this was a woman, than that they feel betrayed in a way. And I do think other versions which are included in this edition kind of play with that element a bit more. And some of them also have a marriage attached to it to kind of fully bring Mulan back into the female sphere. But still, I feel like there's a difference there, that the Mulan in the film has to go through a kind of punishment. She has to once again prove her worth by fighting off the Hunnish attack on the capital in order to be fully respected, whereas the service, the military service that she does beforehand, kind of gets wiped away by the reveal of her gender in the film. So I thought that was really intriguing, that the poem on the one hand complicates the idea of gender and yet also allows more fluidity. Yeah, that's I think an idea that I have. I do really like the animated Mulan film. I think it brings a lot of fun aspects to it. The songs are great. And going back to source material and comparing it with a film, you're always going to find things that don't entirely fit, that don't entirely make sense. But I am quite grateful to Disney for introducing me to this story so early on in my life, because now I get to revisit it as a grown woman. So yeah, that was a potentially slightly rambling episode, but I hope you've got something of an idea of what these earliest versions of the Mulan tale were like, what aspects came up, the way in which they represent this constant questioning of gender performance, gender roles, and how these tales also need to be read carefully. We can read them as a source of liberation of gender roles, or we can read them as a reaffirming of those gender roles. And it is always good to remember these tales can be used by any stream of thinking. We can read them for liberation, but we can also read them towards nationalism. So it's always good to go back to the text, to the source itself, and see what it actually says. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.